Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this Scrutiny Management Committee public hearing, the outcome of which will feed into the committee's review on island-wide voting. I'm Yvonne Burford, and with me on the panel are Advocate Chris Green and Ms Michelle Leclerc, and also the Scrutiny Principal Officer, Mr Mark Huntington. There's two one-hour sessions this afternoon on two different subjects, commencing with the mechanics of elections and electoral systems. The Scrutiny Management Committee's review panel commissioned a survey recently which attracted over 1,400 responses. In some of the questions today, we'll be referring to data that emerged from that survey. In addition, several of our witnesses today submitted written representations to our call for evidence, and where that is the case, we may ask them individual questions based on those submissions. If I can respectfully ask the witnesses to endeavour to be as concise as they can in their answers so that we can cover as much ground as possible in the time available. And please be advised that the hearing will be live streamed, and in due course a Hansard transcript of the hearing will be published on the Scrutiny website. So if everyone could please ensure their phones are set to silent, I will now ask the witnesses to give them a brief introduction of themselves, starting with Mr Doherty, please.
My name is Alistair Doherty. I am a former House of Commons clerk and have also worked on democracy building and parliamentary strengthening around the world, and including Guernsey. Not that it needs much strengthening, but I've had a connection with the committee for a while.
Good afternoon, Matt Fallais. I was a deputy for 12 years, which included a spell as President of the States Assembly and Constitution Committee during the time when proposals were being developed for a referendum on the electoral system.
My name is Kevin Bales. I'm a professor at the University of Nottingham, and my work is in human rights. In the past, I worked a good deal with different types of political organizations doing opinion polling and sometimes campaign building, including, I brought along a picture of the very first Democratic ballot ever put in South Africa, because one of my clients was the African National Congress, and I brought it along just because all the pain and suffering that went in for decades to reach a moment of democracy, which is encapsulated in a ballot. I just thought it's worth remembering that it takes a lot of work and a lot of time and a lot of heart to get to that point.
Okay, well, we'll move straight into the questions then. And so, anyone feel free to answer these unless we specifically direct them at a particular person. So the first question we have is, what challenges do you believe particularly impact on electoral systems in small jurisdictions?
Well, he's the expert.
Well, no, I'm an expert in parliaments rather than on how people get into them. But here goes anyway. I think one of the factors from what I've read of the literature about small jurisdictions is they refer to a hyper-personalisation of parliaments in small countries, and that parties are harder to establish, so that's one feature, and where parties are established, they tend to be in support vehicles for local big political figures rather than programmatic parties. So that's one of the difficulties, and I think that's been drawing on research in Caribbean countries and Malta. And what then happens is where you have, say, a majoritarian electoral system that can embed a local elite who then use their power of patronage to make appointments and so on, and that they can be very hard to remove. And then when they are removed, quite often the opposition behaves in a very similar manner.
Well, I agree with what Alistair has said. I think in our case, in Guernsey, the challenges are compounded because we have this unusual situation of not having political parties. There was an attempt or an experiment to have parties or coalitions of candidates at the last election. But essentially, we have, for decades anyway, we have not had political parties. And most candidates who were elected at the last election weren't in parties. And in addition to that, we don't have an executive system of government. So the first of those creates this challenge of a link between what is decided at the ballot box and what happens in government. So where you have parties, as Alistair has referred to, they put out programmes for government in advance of the election, and whichever party or coalition of parties wins a majority of seats has a mandate to implement their programme for government. And in Guernsey, in the absence of parties, we don't have anything like that. So all of that work on policy development and the programme for government is being done post-election. I think that makes it even harder. And the absence of executive government, which can be argued as a good thing or a bad thing, but certainly it means that there is a difficult trade-off in Guernsey between democracy and leadership. So whereas almost everywhere else, people are used to electing parliamentarians to sit in Parliament, and the Parliament then, through whatever mechanism, is effectively electing the jurisdiction's leadership. In Guernsey, we've kind of fused those things together. So I think in addition to the points Alistair makes, those things are more complicated in Guernsey than anywhere else.
I don't think I'm the expert these chaps are, but I am a voter. And I think that one of the key and fundamental parts about this, and also having lived in other countries, is that democracy should be representative, and it should be representative of some place or some ideological unit or some political party, in the sense that a person knows, in a sense, who or what they are representing when they cast their vote, as opposed to simply casting a vote for the person that they may or may not like, or what they might have said at one point. It's a tricky one because, again, Guernsey is almost unique in many ways, in that once the link to Parish and Duzaine and so forth was severed, it left us with, in another country, they might have said, well, proportional representation would work fine because we can represent ourselves according to the group of people, like the Marxists, for example, who might. That was a joke. She was recently called a Marxist. That's all. That you could say, well, at least I'm representing my comrades, right? But we have neither. Right, in many ways, we have neither, except informal or slightly formal coteries of buddies or sometimes interest groups, and that begins to put you into back rooms and chattering between people to make deals. And I think that's where it would lead to. And I think we need to find a way to ground ourselves, to put our feet soundly on the dirt of our parish and or our ideological or political senses and orientations.
Okay, thank you. This kind of follows on to some of the comments that you've made. So way back in 2007, the Electoral Reform Society said, there are possible models for all island voting, but unfortunately they all present significant practical difficulties because of the size of the states of deliberation and the lack of political parties in Guernsey. Were they right?
Well, I think so. I think so. And I think that if I think that there's a potential for some kind of compromise, in the sense that there could be a return to linkages to geographical or parish or Duzaine linkage, but also some at a kind of at large, a bit like the old concierges that would represent subgroups, possibly, and people would be able to run island-wide, but in a very small group of those, 10 or 12, something like that, within the states. That was something that I put in my evidence and said, here's a possibility, but I'm no expert. Some people have been around this track a few more times, but I think it would be one of those things that'd be worth considering, in part because you'd be able to say, are there people who are truly expert in a specific topic or issue that really has an impact on islanders? And if there was someone who knew everything about healthcare and how it was provided, or the education system and so forth, I'm not saying that states members don't become expert, but if someone had, say, worked in a space for a very long time.
Those are the people that you would see standing island-wide then?
Yeah, potentially, yes.
And it seems to me it might be difficult as to how to restrict people from standing island-wide if they didn't have those great specialisms, and also the extent to which you think people might vote for somebody because of those specialisms, or they might just vote for them because they like them.
Well, I think that's always the case. Sorry.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah.
you know, when people go to vote for anyone, some people like them, some people don't. Some people actually understand who they're voting for. Some people have read their records, some people haven't. And so that's always a crapshoot in democracy.
Right. Michelle?
I think Matt wants to come in.
What they also said, the electoral reform, I think I'm quoting from the same paper that you did. They said a nationwide constituency system, which is what island-wide voting is, could only feasibly operate in Guernsey if one of the following conditions were met. One, candidates coalesced into parties, or two, there were fewer seats to be filled. However, any more than 20 seats would make any system problematic. And the issue, obviously, that they were getting at wasn't that there's anything particularly meritorious or otherwise about parties, but that you have to try to restrict the number of choices that face voters. And that if voters are faced with more than, well, in their opinion, 20 choices, it becomes extremely difficult to make an objective judgment comparing parties or candidates with each other. So, I mean, there are pros and cons of island-wide voting, but I think what, as a jurisdiction, we have to recognise is that we now have a radically different electoral system from almost everywhere else in the world. And that is bound to have a significant impact on our democracy and the functioning of our government.
Could I just come back to there was a point Matt made about democracy and leadership, and I think one of the points which Matt identified was the lack of an executive, that parties form because they want to capture power. Now, whether they're programmatic parties or whether they're just a cheer group for an elite, but what they want is to storm the citadel and grab power, and that's not what happens here. And it's a very strange sort of lacuna in the setup. On the point about the Electoral Reform Society, Gibraltar has island-wide voting, peninsula-wide voting, and it's got 17 seats. And but they actually have parties as well.
Do you think, we've discussed some of the difficulties of island-wide voting, do you think those difficulties can be overcome? And I think, Professor Bales, you've already touched on that, you know, you saying link back to the design, you talk about concierge, so just sort of an open question, do you think they can be overcome, and what system might be the better system, perhaps going forward, if you've got any suggestions?
The one tiny thing I'd say is that, and I'd say this from decades of experience of doing outreach research of all different types with large populations. And if I had attempted to do some kind of information gathering exercise using something like the ballot in the last election, it would have been chaos. It would have been chaos, and it would not have, I think, necessarily led me to anything. I mean, if we were able somehow to design a system that could allow people to really understand what they were about with so many people to vote, 80 and more, possibly, but I can't imagine what it would be, and I've spent an awful lot of time working on how best to reach broad populations in a way where everyone will understand what they're being asked.
Matt?
Well, there is a preliminary question, which is, do you want to have island-wide representatives? I mean, in a way, I'm not sure that question was ever satisfactorily answered politically. What are island-wide representatives giving you, which district representatives can't? But just parking that to one side, if you want to have island-wide representatives, and particularly if you want all members of the states to be island-wide deputies, I always took the view that you had to split at the elections. So, for example, one of the options in the referendum, I think it was option E, was to have 12 or 13 seats elected every 2 years. Now, there was a potential weakness of that, if it is a weakness, which was that a term would be 6 years long, and that is not ideal. But it would at least get the number of candidates and the number of votes down to a manageable number while protecting whatever is perceived to be special or advantageous about the island-wide mandate. My suspicion is that if the system is retained with all deputies being elected island-wide, not at the next election, and maybe not at the one after that, but certainly sooner rather than later, I think there will be a change in the timetable of elections, because I think people will get fed up with having 100 candidates and 38 votes.
I thought option E was, speaking as a complete outsider here, unless political parties develop and are able to be sustained, I could see the merit in option E, because in a sense what we have with political parties is they, at certain moments in life, there's a sea change in the tide of public opinion. 1945, 1979, 1997, you can see it in the UK. There are these swings, and that's represented by not just a shift of government, but the mood of the electorate's changed, and that gets captured. Where you don't have political parties, I think there's a greater emphasis on the states being representational of its electorate and being. Now, the problem is you're in a constant electoral cycle, but the benefit is that you are actually reflecting what the current thinking in the population is by topping up every 2 years.
So what do you think is actually, for the development of political parties, what is actually needed? Because we didn't see parties in Guernsey, they were sort of loose parties. They weren't in the sense of the understood like UK parties. So what do you think is needed to develop parties on the island for island-wide voting?
Well, some desire to have. I mean, does the electorate want parties?
Yes.
I mean, parties don't generally emerge top down. They're not. They are normally they are kind of bottom up movements, either because a group of people, as Alistair has said, want to obtain power, whatever that means in Guernsey, or because there is a group in society who feel underrepresented. Which is how parties of the centre-left, Labour parties, typically came into being because the working class felt underrepresented. Now, I just don't think those dynamics exist in Guernsey, and so the creation of parties has looked very much like a kind of top-down exercise. I might be very wrong, but my impression is that the prevailing view in Guernsey is very sceptical about political parties, and I was always sceptical that you could hold them together after the election. I think the first one, the Partnership of Independence, evaporated after about a week, and the Guernsey Party after maybe a year. So the experiment with parties to that extent has not lasted, has it?
No, indeed. I mean, we had 16 party members elected, and I believe there are 2 now.
Yeah. All right.
So,
Could I go back to the sort of the rolling notion, though? Because when you were talking about an election every couple of years and so forth, but what I just want to say, because I've worked on the American side as well, and the way the Senate is organized in the United States is that senators are elected for 6 years, but 1/3 are elected every 2 years. So it rolls, but they actually stay in for quite a long time, and it gives it a stability and so
It doesn't
forth.
look very stable at the moment.
Well, no. But I have to say, we're in some kind of alternate universe at the moment over there, and I couldn't interpret it or anything. But in the past, for at least a couple of hundred years, it worked pretty well.
Yeah.
I mean, the current troubles are not due necessarily to the electoral system.
No. Well, some other parts of the electoral system, but not that. But not
It
that
has
one.
been stable.
Yeah, it has been stable, and the Senate particularly so. And so the idea of a rolling, but with where people would understand, and these are people, and there's always a continuity, and that you don't end up with a dramatic shift where you bring in a lot of newbies and a lot of other people go out, and then you have this kind of lived experience, and programs and policies can continue over time. That seems a possibility.
I think for parties, there are two sides to this. I come back to this point about power. Parties want power, whether they're good parties, meaning they have a programme, or whether they're, in my view, bad parties, meaning they're just elites and they're a popular figure with supporters. But whatever the nature of a party is, it wants to get power. And if there's no executive form of government, I don't think parties are that interested. And then, of course, the other point about sustaining parties is there has to be some form of discipline and collective responsibility, and that seems to be where it broke down here, or one of the factors.
Well, I think and I was originally on SAC with Matt at the time, and I think what happened was that we went to the referendum without necessarily having in place procedures, rules, protocols for parties to establish themselves. So would you agree that maybe that should have happened first, to give greater guidelines to potential parties? Perhaps, Matt, with hindsight.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you're in an environment with parties, they need to be quite strongly regulated. I mean, that is typical, around expenditure, behaviours, candidate selection, manifestos. So we organised the election, or the states did, really on the basis that there wouldn't be parties, because there never had been. Now, yes, but you could argue that if you can't kind of preempt parties, you can't establish rules for parties until parties emerge, and I'm not sure whether there will be parties at the next election, but I think there will be even more reservations given what happened last time.
And I'd remind ourselves that there are parties and then there are parties. So you have the British and American systems where you have these adversarial pair of parties fundamentally. And then I've been fortunate enough to work with the Norwegian Parliament and a couple of times with the Dutch Parliament. And there the proportional representation means that it takes some time for things to occur and to work through the political process, but when they reach that point of real compromise and agreement, it sticks. It's not thrown out at the next election. Tend to be. I was very impressed with how it could really work. It took longer, but it tended to go deeper, and then it tended to be permanent, or as close to permanent as political actions can get, because the agreement had been reached across the proportions of the different political groups. Right?
I mean, Deputy Leclerc, it's a bit chicken and egg, I think. I imagine it would have been rather hard to go into this referendum where parties had not existed, but to say, and if parties come about, they will have these privileges in the States, because that's what happens. The political groups are recognised and they're given certain privileged positions in a parliament. And coming from a basis of all independence to that would have been slightly difficult, I think.
Go back to the 2020 election and the survey that we commissioned. According to that survey, the most used and the most useful source of information employed by the voter when deciding how to vote was, by quite a considerable margin, the State's Manifesto booklet. And the question really is, does that surprise you? And what, if anything, does that reveal? Matt?
No, it doesn't surprise me, because it was really the only organised way that voters had of obtaining information. So under the previous system, districts or parishes before that, there were hustings where all of a voter's candidates were put in front of the voter. It was obviously much easier to knock on most, if not all, doors. Not every candidate did, but there were a large proportion which did. And there were, more candidates who delivered or sent out their manifestos. So the opportunities for the voter to see their candidates side by side and compare them there were many more. The candidate booklet really became the only way in 2020. Now, the candidate booklet was, I suppose, the right thing to do in the sense that recognising this potential gap of information, the states had to do something. And the election was, let's acknowledge, it was very well organised from a logistical point of view. But the booklet was 2 pages per candidate, half of which was taken up with a photo and, all that stuff about where the person lived or what their age was or that kind of background information. And the space for the candidate to explain their policies was minimal. Now, what that means is that you, was it Shalane, I think, the other day, your first hearing, your second hearing, who said, the way in which people will make decisions at elections in that kind of environment becomes much more simplistic because you just don't have the material and the way of comparing candidates against each other. So I think what that has meant is that the choices that people are making at elections are reduced to much more simple considerations. At the last election, if you said, well, I don't want 2 schools and I don't want GST, and you were a reasonable candidate, you were almost certain to get in. Because it lends itself to this kind of checklist election where the only way in which voters are able to compare their choices is to use, a small number of criteria on very key issues. And I don't think there's a way around that if you present 120 candidates to a voter.
Yeah, that leads very strongly into, in fact, you virtually answered the next question, which is, do you think there's an issue with people just relying on a 2-page document that they possibly haven't even written themselves to inform such important decisions? And clearly you do, Matt, from what you said, but what do you think the fallout of that was?
Could I just come in on something that Matt said? I thought it was interesting that the couple of things you picked out were both negative. That if somebody said, I don't want this and I don't want that, they would get in. I think what's much harder when I read the pamphlet, what's good about it is it's just 2 pages. It's set out in identical ways. You can compare like with like. But if somebody did put, in the absence of political parties, if somebody said, these are the things I want, I'd look at that and think, yeah, how's that going to come about, in a non-party system? So I thought it was interesting, actually, that the impact was a negative that maybe it was just you didn't mean it that way, but it was voting against something rather than for.
And it was only the version of what you had in the paper. I tried to be a very assiduous voter that time around, and so I would go to all the speed dating, whatever they were called, the kind of quick hustings or whatever it was called, and what I found was a few times that the person that I thought would make a great candidate, when I got to actually talk to them, I realized, oh my goodness, I don't want that person at all. And occasionally, people that I wasn't so sure at actually, but if you leave the humanity out of it, it's hard to get the true sense of it, especially when everybody's been reduced to 2 pages. So that's an interesting problem as well.
That's a very interesting point, because compared to the previous election, there isn't this face-to-face element, as Matt has said. But if you're recruiting for a job in industry or something, yes, you start with the CV, but then you want to see the person face to face. And that section of it was almost absent from island-wide voting. Do you think there's any remedy to that?
No. I mean, I thought it was a hugely demoralising experience because I had been used to but essentially knocking on the door of every elector. Now, of course, lots of people are not in, but I mean, even if a third of people are, you end up having hundreds, if not over 1,000 conversations over the course of 4 or 5 weeks. And you know that you're reaching a very large proportion of your electorate. Now, even if you flew around the island like Deputy Roffey did at the last election, where he did about 12 hours every day or more, but I don't know how many people he got to, but I bet it wasn't more than a quarter or a third of houses. And I very much kind of got the sense that it was an election really being fought on social media, or somewhere away from where the candidates actually were, because you just couldn't have that that discourse with the electorate that you could in the previous system. I mean, there are some. We're talking about the disadvantages. There are advantages of island-wide voting, but there are these real practical challenges. Yeah.
Yeah, we will come to the advantages shortly. In our survey, leaving out the don't knows, 2/3 of the respondents said that the number of votes each person has available to them at island-wide voting should be reduced. And of those who thought the number should be reduced, 83% thought it should be 20 or less. Does this response surprise you, and what is your view on the matter?
Well, it doesn't surprise me. I might have said exactly the same thing. And in the note that I sent in, I was saying I think there are probably ways to reduce that, or to break it, or if you went to rolling, that would also reduce the number. I think there's probably 3 or 4 different ways to reduce that grappling with everybody in the phone book situation. But I think that's an important part of it, because it was unwieldy and overwhelming, I think, for a lot of people. And if they were people, I said in my note, if people with very busy lives, people with small kids, you think of them trying to work their way through those booklets over time and make a sense of everything. And I'm not trying to disparage their focus, just that their time can be hard for a lot of people. And I thought, it was hard enough for me, and I was trying to really devote time to it.
Thank you.
Matt, do you want to come in?
Yeah, there is kind of instinctively, there is an attraction to that, because you have the sense that it would reduce the number of wasted votes. People thinking, I've got 38 votes, so I better use them. There are 10 people I really would like to vote for, and then I'm going to sprinkle around 28 like, confetti. Essentially just avoiding the names of the people I really want to get out. I mean, I think that was probably the psyche of quite a lot of voters. So there is an attraction to that. But on the other side, the practical issue is not really the number of votes. It's the number of candidates. It's the challenge that faces the voter is making an objective comparison between 119 candidates. That's the challenge, and whether the voter has 1 vote or 38 doesn't change this challenge of objectively comparing the candidates. And the last thing I'd say on this is, I think giving voters fewer votes than they have seats to fill. I'm trying to think. I think that's an unconventional approach. I'm not sure that is used in many elections, and we've already got Gibraltar do. But with parties, but we now have a really unconventional electoral system. I would be reluctant to see us heaping even more unorthodox solutions on top of what we've already got.
I think there's quite a lot we don't know still, and so all these people say there were too many, had too many votes, but I have a feeling that quite a lot of people used all those votes. Now, what we need to know is why. Maybe it was anybody but Matt vote. Sorry, Matt, but that's...
I think it was.
Yeah, there was a logic. I mean, whereas some people say that voters were flying blind in making their choices, were they? I mean, maybe they were voting for a political party, or maybe they were voting for anybody but supporters of the education reform, in which case... that's slightly different from flying blind and voting randomly, and I don't think we know that yet.
we received is that people were using all of their votes in an effort to keep people out, knowing that other people also had 38 votes to be able to do that. But I suppose, I don't know, I'm just putting this to you, if everyone had 20 votes, then they'd all know that they're all up against the same limit, so it's fair, and I think that was the point there. And so you're saying, Matt, that, I mean, clearly reducing votes isn't going to affect the number of candidates you've got to wade through, but you're suggesting that it might stop people sprinkling their later votes around with less consideration.
Yeah, well, I think, yes, I mean, logically, the fewer votes people have, the more likely a greater proportion of their votes are to be taken up with candidates they're positively voting for, rather than candidates they're choosing as their 30th or 38th choice. So a more considered decision, possibly. I think that could well arise, but I would still be sceptical about another quite unorthodox approach.
Yeah, interestingly, in the document we referred to in the Electoral Reform Society from 2007, one of the mitigations they give if Guernsey is insistent on going down the road of island-wide voting is to have fewer votes. Yeah. So that's a possibility. Can I just come yes, please do.
It was just picking up on earlier comments about one potential solution on island-wide voting was this every 2 years. Of course, there would be an extra cost to that. But how significantly do you think that would reduce? Because part of the problem is this choosing from 118 candidates. If we went to that rolling island-wide voting, yes, you would have fewer people actually voted in every 2 years. But what is the likelihood that those candidates are still going to be as large? And in fact, you then end up having to pick, say, 10 candidates from 70 people putting themselves forward.
Yeah, well, I don't know who it was on Monday who said they thought that the number of candidates will be fewer at the next election. I think that is probably true. There must have been a novelty factor. So I don't necessarily say that the number will settle at around 120. First of all, I mean, if you do have rolling elections and you divide the seats in the states into thirds, then, of course, there would be 26 people already sitting in the states who wouldn't be standing for election. I mean, you would still have a large number of candidates, but I suspect that you could get it down to something like 50, which is, materially different to 100 or 120. The disadvantage, I don't think, is having an election every 2 years. The Guernsey used to have elections every 3 years when deputies' terms were 3 years. I think the big challenge for someone who wanted to persuade the electorate of that kind of system, the big challenge is moving away from the concept of a general election, because every time you go to the polls, 2/3 of your seats are untouchable. You can't have any influence on them.
That would trouble people, do you?
I would think there would be a perception of a kind of deficit of democracy. Yeah, and that would have to be countered by those favouring it. But
I think in a situation where you've completely eschewed the idea of parties, that's just not going to happen. I can see I could see it being viewed as, we are maintaining our representational role, that we're constantly in touch with the electorate. But on the reducing the number, I mean, Richard Diggard said, well, these are all workarounds, and they are, in a sense, that, he thinks it's a flawed system, but how can we work around the problems? Two of the obvious reasons, obvious ways of reducing the number seem to be completely discounted. I mean, one is putting up money for a deposit. That idea seems to go nowhere. And then the other one is getting a load of nominations. But when I look at the numbers of votes that everybody gets, everybody here seems to have a couple of thousand friends. So, the idea of saying we need nominations, would you'd get them, wouldn't you? So and then the other thing, Richard Diggard's suggestion was about an induction programme. Now, I don't know whether that's both a workaround, hoping that some people will drop out, and also a good idea in itself, I guess.
Okay.
If we could move on slightly, the question I've got here is, to what extent do you think that the decision to hold a referendum on the electoral reform system in Guernsey was a parallel to the decision to hold a referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union, and this notion, perhaps a flawed notion, that let's put it to a referendum, let's put it to bed, let's have a decision and then stop talking about it. What's your take on that, and whether it is a direct parallel, and whether we've ended up in a situation in Guernsey where we've really not put the issue to bed? Professor Bowles?
Well, that was some years ago, and I hadn't been on the island as long as I have now. Coming from the outside, I thought, I have to admit, I thought when that came up, something's dicey here. There's some sort of stitch-up going on. I don't understand the local politics well enough because I'm new, and I don't understand all these personal relationships that go on across family lines and so forth, and church affiliations and so forth. But I smelled something, and it wasn't nice right from the beginning when I confronted this, after being in different other political situations and other different types. And I couldn't quite understand, how the fundamental, the true logic behind it. I kept trying to take it apart and say, how could this be better? And to my eye, I couldn't find the good in it. And I kept wondering, who's pushing this, and why are they pushing it now?
Any further reflections?
I think there's a huge difference in that the decision on whether to have island-wide voting or not is a matter entirely for you. It's nobody else is going to. There's no other party to the decision. With Brexit, there's the UK's decision to leave, and if you're talking about rejoining, there's the EU. They will have a view on that. I personally don't think the EU will be interested in an application from the UK for quite a while. Actually.
Matt, do you think there's something in that perceived reason for holding the referendum? Let's put it to bed, but that then hasn't really worked here.
About. So the states were debating a requête for, I think it was 7 seats to be elected island-wide.
It's the Aaron Wilkie requête.
Yeah. And deep into the debate, an amendment was created to have every seat elected island-wide. I think on a bizarre idea of having one election of an experiment in that way, and then going back to districts the following election. But anyway, and the states voted in favour of that amendment. So now that was unexpected, I think. And the idea of a referendum came from Heidi Soulsby and I having a conversation, saying it's extraordinary that on the back of a fact packet, the states have just voted to adopt this system of everyone being elected island-wide. Surely there shouldn't be quite that much of a radical change to the electoral system unless the electorate has said that's what it wants. And that's where the idea of a referendum was born. The parallel with Brexit wasn't really to try and put the issue to bed forever, but it was to avoid the problem that the UK got itself into post the referendum result of the Parliament then saying, OK, Brexit has been supported in a referendum, but we don't really have any idea what type of Brexit that means. Right. And the fear that those of us who were kind of working on the referendum had was that if it was a yes-no referendum, yes would win, so the public would say, yes, we want island-wide voting, and the states would then spend years, literally years, deciding what type of island-wide voting does this mean. Does it mean all seats, some seats, half of the seats elected every 2 years, all seats elected every 4 years, or whatever it was? So the idea was, if we've got to have this referendum, let's emerge from it with absolute clarity about the system of island-wide voting the public wants. And to that extent, I think the referendum worked, because after the referendum result, nobody argued about what the system should be. It was clear that the direction that had been given, and the states got on and implemented it, logistically very well.
If we fast forward to the survey that we've done and the views that are coming out in terms of a certain level of disgruntlement with the system that we've got, do you think there's a sense that you're always really going to have a situation here that people are not really happy with the system that is in place? They're always going to be clutching for some possible alternative that may or may not be practical. Do you think there's a sense that people are just unhappy with the states in general, and maybe that then filters through to the electoral system as well? Is there something in that?
So that's like the idea that a referendum is you always have people who are just voting against the government, no matter what the question is. I don't know. I mean, I was just going to ask. Sorry, I shouldn't be asking questions, but the referendum was. I mean, the real question was about island-wide voting, but then all these other options were put in, and I suppose my question was, were they real runners, or were they there just to pad out the form, as it were?
No, I mean, whichever option. Well, the proposal was that if the turnout exceeded 40%, the states would accept the result as binding. And I, once that got through the states, I don't think there was any doubt that whichever option won the referendum was going to be implemented. What was your question, Chris? Sorry.
Isn't it always the case that the people are always going to be against the system that is in place now?
I think Guernsey suffers from that particularly because of the absence of parties. If people get fed up with the government, they can't say, like they can in other places, we're fed up with the party of government, we'll kick them out. What tends to happen is that the kind of permanent features of our government system are criticised. The kind of the institution of the states, the role of a deputy, the voting system, the system of government, they all absorb the criticism which in other jurisdictions the governing party would absorb. So yes, that's why those issues keep coming back time and again, I think.
Okay, thank you. Michelle.
Yes. A question for Professor Bales. You said in your submission that you believed a supermajority should have been required in order to change the electoral system. Can you expand on that? I think you were referring probably to the US Constitution.
And other countries' constitutions as well. I only noted that because there's a certain safety in when you're doing something that could dramatically alter democratic processes and dramatically alter the quality of representation of the individual voter. You need to be able to protect that from political attack or whatever, or just not thinking it through clearly enough. And for that reason, I would say, why not a 2/3, 1/3, or something like that? I think that's been a very important thing in a lot of countries. And has kept sometimes bad things away and good things away as well, but sometimes good things can also pass through that. I have to say, though, that when you're confronting 5 different options, and then there's no sense of wait, we need to make sure we really have a clear majority coming down on which one of these 5 options, and it ends up in a situation where you wipe 2 or 3 out, and then you're at a 2-horse race for the last 2, and it goes to 52-48. Yeah. Then I don't think that's good democracy, personally.
If I understood Matt correctly, there was you wouldn't call it a supermajority, but built into it was the idea that 40% had to vote in favour of the successful option. Is that right?
No. 40% had to participate in the referendum.
Just to be a valid.
Yes.
But it took 2 attempts to get that threshold through the states, right? Because there were quite a large number of states members who were arguing that the thing should be binding irrespective of the turnout.
Yeah. The next question for Matt. In your policy letter when you were President of SAC on the referendum in the last term, you did not list the so-called hybrid system as one of the 5 options in the actual policy letter. It was subsequently added to by, in fact, none other than Advocate Green in an amendment, and then it came second in the referendum. Can you explain why your committee saw fit to leave it out of your original 5 options?
I think I'm correct in saying that the basis on which we put forward the options was that in each option there should only be one class of states member. So either all island-wide deputies or all district deputies, but possibly informed by the difficulties Jersey have had over a long period of time with having different classes of states member. And the states Guernsey had had different classes of states member, domain representatives and concierges and deputies. And I think it was felt that that would just be a retrograde step. I wasn't surprised it came second in the referendum once Chris and I think possibly Roger Perro. Richard Graham, of course, yeah. Yes, had inserted it. And if a small prediction, I think that may very well be the system that Guernsey ends up with.
Because it's a compromise? Because
I think it will be very difficult to persuade people that there shouldn't be any island-wide mandate, having had island-wide seats. But I think the practical difficulties of electing everybody island-wide on one day there's a reasonable chance that I think that may push the states into looking for a compromise. And the most obvious one is to have some seats elected island-wide and some seats in parishes or districts.
But once we're on an electoral system from 1994, that system just lasted, that hybrid system essentially just lasted 6 years with falling turnout according to your report.
Yeah.
Do you think it would be wise to go back to it then?
No.
No, would you like to expand on that?
Because I think there is a problem having different classes of statesmen. But I mean, in particular, our system, as others have explained, it's not. We don't have a separate executive from our parliament, and invariably, if you had 10 or 12 seats elected island-wide, it would become, the understanding would be that those were the people who should hold the most senior roles in the states. And there isn't very much correlation at all between electing representatives to a parliament and, senior people who are sitting in the cabinet in one system or leading committees in our system. So I think there are real problems. I think it would work well on election day, but I think there are problems with it post-election in trying to form a government.
Okay, thank you. A question for all of you, perhaps. What do you each see as the principal advantage and the principal disadvantage of island-wide voting? Because we haven't talked much about the advantages. You mentioned that before, and I think before we run out of time quite shortly, we perhaps should have a look at that.
I suppose you can kick people out in a sort of strange way with tactical voting. You can remove people who you don't want, and the concomitant is that you can pile up votes for people who you really like. But the odd thing there is, you think, well, what then? Because you don't have a states which is a hierarchy, and you then give rise to perhaps a public expectation that those people who score the highest should be in positions of senior positions, and that hasn't happened. And
you're right on that, because that's certainly something that came through in comments on our survey, where a lot of people said, why didn't the person who polled the highest get the top job? And so, that's a feeling, and I think that sort of builds in a small way from what Matt said earlier about a hybrid system. There will be an expectation, because there is an expectation already within island-wide voting.
I mean, you get that expectation. In terms of removing people, I mean, that's a perfectly desirable, necessary part of democracy. I think it's societally strange subterfuge you have to go through in order to get there, that you end up voting for unknowns and in order to achieve that effect.
Mm-hmm. Kevin.
I have to say this discussion's been really informative and educational for me, and it's also led me to a particular thought, which is that having heard particularly from the inside story and the histories of a lot of the different changes, of all the systems that we're talking about that could be island-wide, the only one that to me seems to be both logical and most representative and democratically sound would be one that involved rolling elections, because it would reduce the numbers that had to be considered in each election. It would have a long-term stability because of the overlapping tenure and so forth. But I'd like to think that through more. But in terms of, I keep thinking through which one would work out of everything that we mention, and every one of them sort of hits a rock pretty quickly.
I'll put you back to the question on, one advantage, one disadvantage of island-wide voting, or the principal advantage and disadvantage.
That's a tough one, just because I'm not sure there is an advantage unless we go to where we started at the very beginning of this, which was as if you had political parties, that would kind of make sense, and so forth. But there are other ways to break it out. But otherwise, I certainly didn't feel like I was seeing any kind of advantage of the one that we had.
Thank you.
Well, the advantage is the opportunity to have some influence over every seat. Every voter has an influence over every seat. Now, I don't think that means you have more democracy. I think I've worked out if everybody uses all their votes, everyone who votes uses all their votes, I think one vote that's cast in an island-wide election represents 1/1,000,000th of a say over the outcome in Parliament. And in a district system, I think it's 1/25,000th. So actually, what's happening with island-wide voting versus district voting is that the voter is getting a much smaller say over a larger number of seats, whereas in district voting, the voter is getting a larger say over a smaller number of seats. But if you certainly you have an influence over every seat in your parliament, and so that is an advantage of island-wide voting, which in the absence of parties, voters can't otherwise enjoy. The obvious disadvantage logistically is the very large number of candidates, which we've discussed. I think in terms of the kind of the integrity of an election and electing the best possible government, I think the biggest disadvantage is that you completely break down the proximity between the elector, the voter, and the candidate. Mm-hmm. It becomes an election at such greater distance than was ever the case previously. And my view is that the voter is therefore less informed about the candidates and is less likely to make informed choices. If I'm going to vote for someone, I would quite like to speak to them before I'm going to vote. I think through a hustings, through speaking to people on the doorstep, I think you can kind of tell, who is the serious candidates, who's done their homework, and who's chancing it a bit. And I think that's very much harder in an island-wide election.
Presumably, in the absence of parties, if somebody is using 38 votes, there's a very real chance that in those 38 candidates are people whose policies are completely incompatible with each other.
Yes, but I think there's a tendency that may well have happened under a previous system as well.
Yeah, I think there's a history of people voting for candidates with diametrically opposed views. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, you know that happened a lot. I mean, I voted in the Vale for candidates with diametrically opposed views, because actually the most important thing when you're electing to a parliament, the whole parliament, is that you have a diversity of views, and that the people elected are capable of, running the island. That's in a sense that's more important than their specific policies.
Do you think the majority of people approach it in that way?
Yeah, I think they certainly did in the past. Mm-hmm. I think that when you have this much closer proximity between the elector and the candidate, there's a much higher chance that the voter will say, I don't particularly agree with you on this issue or that issue, but taking a kind of rounded view, I think that you are worth a seat in the States. Whereas when you put more distance between the voter and the candidate, it's more likely the voter will make their decision just by going down a checklist. Which way did you vote on that? What's your opinion on that? And that's the way I voted, because there wasn't any other way of having a really good informed understanding of all the candidates.
Okay, I think we're going to have to bring it to a close there. It's been absolutely fascinating. Thank you to all three of you. And we'll now take a short break and reconvene just after 3 o'clock. Okay, good afternoon again, everyone. We've got a session now on political parties, and if I could just move straight into asking the witnesses if they could introduce themselves, a little brief bio, starting with Mr. Pising. Thank you.
Thanks. Right, David Pising. I was an advisor to the Guernsey Party from mid 2020 until February 2023.
Deputy Peter Offey. I've been in and out the States since 1982 and never been a member of any Guernsey political party.
Nigel Delarue. I chaired a working group on behalf of an emerging island party to discuss the merits and demerits of each of the 5 referendum options that were put to the population and to draw some conclusions from that. Apart from that, I'm just interested as a voter all my life, all my adult life in Guernsey.
Okay, we'll move straight into the questions then. So, the first question, does island-wide voting need political parties to function properly? Yes.
Do you want to go or do you want me to? No, you go first. Probably yes. I'd rather have neither. I have to say, but it is a electoral system that was designed to bring about political parties. We had people, Mr. Mayervelt, for instance, was quite open about it. He wanted to move to this sort of system because the only way it would work would be with parties, was what he was saying, and therefore, by changing the electoral system, it would force a change towards a party system, and that was the real objective. What we've ended up with is an electoral system designed for parties that people think can only work properly with parties, but Guernsey doesn't seem, thus far, to be particularly enamoured with parties, so we're stuck with an electoral system which doesn't really fit a system of all independents, and yet we've got all independents. So it's not a good place to be, in my opinion.
To what extent do you think the electorate understood that it was meant to work with parties, if indeed that was the case?
Oh, no, I don't think that was the main reason the electorate voted for it. I think that was the main reason some states members pushed for it. I think the electorate just felt they wanted to stuck their oar in relation to every single person being elected, or, as was said earlier today, perhaps who wouldn't be elected. And they got frustrated that if they were in a district, they couldn't help somebody be elected to the States or help chop somebody out of the States, if you like. And therefore, I think it was what I was getting was mainly on that level.
Okay.
Yes, I agree with most of what Deputy Roffey has said there. The attractiveness of island-wide voting was going to be based on the need for political parties to make it work. I am not convinced that the island is not particularly enamoured with political parties, as he's just said, and I welcome this forum to be able to discuss the merits and demerits of that. But clearly, the fact that political parties haven't emerged is why we're all together and why there's such a level of dissatisfaction with how island-wide voting operated.
Mr. Pising.
I think when the decision was made to go for island-wide voting, of course, we had no guarantee or no knowledge that any parties would actually even emerge. It's quite possible that there wouldn't have been any. And my gut feeling, I mean, I agree with all of those comments, but my gut feeling is that it's probably too early to make the judgment on whether island-wide voting needs political parties or whether political parties need island-wide voting. I think it's very hard to determine a trend based on what was a novel election, and whether more parties will emerge for the next election, and we'll find out more and see more of a trend. Impossible to know at this stage.
Mm-hmm. What do you feel if parties don't emerge? Well, first of all, how many elections do you think we should give it to see whether there is an emergence? And if they don't emerge, do you think that island-wide voting could still carry on anyway?
Again, it's hard to know, because you might get the next election or the next 2 elections where there still are no parties. So you'd be none the wiser. But I would have, thought that any new electoral system probably needs at least 2 or 3 cycles before you can determine a trend. Mm-hmm. It could have been just down to who stood. It could have been down to voter inertia or just people being overwhelmed by the number of candidates. you might have had island-wide voting, and instead of 119 candidates, there might have been only 80, for example, and the whole thing might have gone very differently in terms of how manageable it was. Did anybody really expect 119 candidates?
No,
I didn't. Right? And were they attracted by dissatisfaction with the way government was going? I don't know. We don't know, but 119 was a surprise.
You looked as though you were about to say something different.
Well, I think a lot of people were attracted by thinking, why not give it a punt? We've got nothing to lose. We're going to get given some money, which didn't used to happen, in order to do the campaign. We won't have to go through the trauma of sitting on a hustings because it won't be practical to organise. All we have to do is write something to go in a booklet. We might get in. Who knows what's to lose about it? Nobody's expecting me to knock on doors anymore. I did, but there was no expectation. So I think that might be one of the reasons why you've got so many candidates.
Okay.
May I just add something
yes,
there,
please do.
Deputy Bedford, and it is that I don't think the only option is to carry on having island-wide voting and waiting for parties to emerge. We don't have a written constitution, of course, but we can legislate and we can encourage, we can incentivise the creation of political parties. There are many mechanisms, if one looks around the world, that operate and have operated in order to encourage the formation of political parties. And I think if there's open discussion about the advantages, which I'm sure we're going to come on to, of having political parties, then we can make that work if there is a will to make it work.
Okay, thank you. So 3 parties fielded candidates at the last election, and 16 of the 38 successful candidates were party members, and there were a total of 40 candidates that were party members. So today, just 3 years on, just 2 members of the Assembly still belong to a party. What accounts for this apparent failure?
I don't accept your premise that all of those members who were elected were members of parties in the sense that the rest of the world would know it. I think there were electoral support systems where people grouped together in order to even... I think maybe actually the one party that was close to a real party was the one that got 0 people elected, which was the Alliance Party, because they put forward a set of policies and said there was going to be collective responsibility and whipping and whatever, whereas the others... Guernsey Party was probably slightly more towards that, but certainly wasn't a party that would be recognised elsewhere. And the Coalition of Independence was, I think, not really a party at all. So I just think when people are elected, they just, in a small community, when people say people want them to do things, they're not going to, and they actually agree, they're just not going to turn around and say, no, that's not what my party is telling me to do. They're going to act as independents. And, even in Jersey, where it's a bit more embedded, my understanding of the Jersey Democratic Alliance, whatever it's called, I'm not sure what it's called, but... From Guernsey now, is that there's no collective responsibility or people are free to vote how they want. I don't think that's a party as it will be understood elsewhere.
Okay, because if there was a party whip, there's no real penalty to anyone for not upholding the whip.
Losing the whip, I guess.
Yeah, but then you're still a states member and you're still in government.
Yep.
So, okay. Michelle?
Yeah, right. Some submissions to our call for evidence pointed an increased influence of the civil service as a consequence of island-wide voting. In the absence of political parties and a government with its programme, is the civil service always likely to fill the vacuum? And in your view, is that happening?
So I don't want to overtalk here, but yeah, so go.
Well, yes, and I did have something to say on the previous question.
Sorry.
But which was simply that we can't assess the merits and demerits of a party system on the back of what happened in the 2020 election and what parties were formed. It's a much broader issue than that. And when it comes to whipping and party rules, we have to appreciate that what we're talking about when we use the word party is not simply what is seen as a party in UK politics or elsewhere in the world. We are covering a very, very wide definition, which is included, in fact, in the guidance notes for the registration of political parties in Guernsey. I shan't bore you with reading it out, but it's a very broad definition that includes lists and and list systems around the world don't necessarily demand that members of the list vote according to a set policy. So there isn't necessarily a whipping system. There's flexibility around that to differing degrees. But when it comes to the influence of civil servants, and of course I'm neither a civil servant, neither have I ever been a serving politician, it's difficult for me to comment on that, other than to say, yes, there certainly is a vacuum, because there is no parliament that isn't a government in Guernsey. They are one and the same thing. And therefore, apart from what happens at committee level, which is the formulation of policy in certain areas, there is no forum for the discussion of policy amongst people who are either candidates for being elected or elected representatives, or indeed other interested individuals. So there isn't any transparent discussion that I'm aware of that I can point to, other than what is described as tribalism or collusion.
Okay, Peter.
I think the suggestion was what were the surveys
Well, the
saying
survey
was
is
leading to an increased influence for civil servants?
Yes, our call for evidence indicates that there's an increased influence of the civil servants over government
As a
result of island-wide voting, because there appears to be publicly there appears to be some vacuum.
Indirectly, maybe. I think the influence of the civil service goes up when there's a large number of novice deputies in the Assembly. I think people who've been around the block for quite a few times will not take nonsense from civil servants. And I'm not saying most civil servants talk nonsense. I think that they have a working relationship, and they're also actually more used to driving policy rather than, I think sometimes newbies come in and they want to be a politician, and then on day one don't seem to realise that the clue's in the name. That means you're meant to make policy, and they almost look to the civil service to tell them what should be happening inside their departments or whatever else. So if island-wide voting increased, and I'm not saying it did, what the reason was, increased, and there was a large turnover in membership, but they may have been under a district system as well, then I think the more novices you have in, the more that creates a sort of vacuum for a year or two anyway, where the civil servants feel the need to come in and fill that vacuum.
I'd agree with that. That last point particularly. I think, there's no doubt that people who are not familiar with the system will take time to get used to that system. And that does create that opportunity for civil servants to have more influence over those individuals who simply don't know their way around the system. And there's no way of getting experience other than to get experience. I mean, that's just the reality. So I totally agree with that point.
But I also think there's a saloon bar wisdom that civil servants really want to run the island. My experience is that civil servants actually want politicians that are strong-minded, know where they want to go and want to make policy. They feel far more comfortable working in that, even if they may not necessarily disagree with them. I can think of one or two civil servants who don't fit that, haven't over the years fitted that, and I think should really have stood for election if they felt that strongly, but not the way if you go into a public bar, you think that of the civil services running the island and making all the decisions. I don't think it's true at all.
Okay. I think perhaps some of that has come, and we had a comment on Monday that a lot of the time now we see a spokesperson rather than a named deputy. But we'll move on to the next question. It appears from what has happened since the election in October 2020 that island-wide voting did nothing to aid the development of successful parties. We've discussed that already. What do you think needs to happen to get successful parties? Perhaps Nigel.
Perhaps I could kick off on that by just going back one stage. Richard Digger asked the question on Monday, why island-wide voting? What was the perceived advantage going to be? And I don't think that those who voted in the referendum necessarily thought that the advantage would be the creation of political parties, full stop. I believe that the electorate made a clear statement that they were more interested in island-wide politics than they were parish or electoral district politics. I think that particularly among younger people, I think that they are interested in political philosophy, in vision, in the direction of travel. Young people that I speak to, and I have young children, still not quite middle-aged, but who are engaged in politics, but worldwide or nationally, they have no interest whatsoever in what's happening in their parish. During my time as an elector, I've only written to I don't think I've ever written to my parish deputies on a parish issue. I only want access to politicians to discuss island-wide issues. And it's because we're a small nation and we have all of the issues to confront as a small nation of taxation, of education, health, social care, fighting poverty. We're an internationally recognised centre for financial services. And my experience of, for example, of the 2012 election in the Vale was that I had to choose 7 candidates from 9 options. And that's all the say I had in what happened in the island. And I wasn't alone. That may have improved in 2016 to choosing 6 from 11. But still, my say in how the island is run was microscopic. I had no part to play, and neither did I have a point to lobby my deputies. So forgive me just sort of going back to why I feel that island-wide voting, what it was intended to achieve. And as for, Michelle Clare, I'm sorry, I've forgotten your exact question that I diverted myself away from. But
well, it was just to say that what do we need to make parties
work?
successful? Yeah.
That's the second leg of why island-wide voting could have worked. There were 2 legs to it. One was give the option to the population to participate in choosing candidates to represent them in central government, so they had 100% say, whereas they had only 15% say on a 7 regional basis. They wanted to say what happened centrally. But that, I'm afraid, and it's already been identified by the Electoral Reform Society, had to be accompanied by a party political system. And that was the conclusion of the working group I was on, which was why we didn't think that to vote for island-wide voting at that point, because there were no political parties, there wasn't time to form them efficiently, would have been a good idea. And we had an option towards a gradualist approach. But so we're halfway there. We got a half-baked solution.
Yeah, no, you go.
Okay. I'm going to answer your question and respond to Nigel's first point, because I don't think when people were elected in districts it was ever any less a consideration of a candidate's island-wide views. I mean, I've got elected 6 times in districts. Nobody sort of said, okay, the odd Vale issue or later on South East issue may have come up, but people were just choosing in districts who they thought was best to deal with the whole island. It wasn't parochial politics in that sense. It was just a way of ergonomically electing people to be in the island parliament. That may, I'm not sort of disagreeing that I don't think people are just interested in. Some people are just interested in parochial matters, but I think very few are. As for, sorry, again, I've got to remind myself the second question, so we keep going.
If we develop, if we continue with island-wide voting and we go down the path of parties, we've seen already that those have not been successful. What do we need to do? What do we need to provide to make parties successful? What can we do?
Tricky question for me, because I don't really want them to develop. So I may be better leaving that. Although I do see some of the advantages to parties, I just think the Guernsey context here vastly outweighed by the disadvantages. So I haven't really put my mind to how to encourage something I don't want to happen.
Which I think is a valid point, because I think we're putting the cart before the horse. I think we need to end up with that question if we agree that
but
on
Dave,
what the advantages
you've there in establishing a party, helping to establish a party, and you've now seen that sort of disintegrate. So what do you think you would do different next time, for example?
I think the most important thing is to have started a lot earlier. And the lead-in period probably is 18 months to 2 years before an election, not 3 to 4 months, because I think there is just far too much to be done to create a party from scratch and recruit and identify who is suitable for joining your party when you are still formalising your manifesto. You really, to throw that together in 3 or 4 months is a heck of a challenge. And it also means that you haven't been preparing for the next election by following what's going on in as much detail as you would if you had a party, an embryonic party now, right, which people might not even know exists, might be doing an awful lot of planning for the next election, right, but preparing in far more detail than you could possibly do if you throw it together too quickly. So you've got to be prepared. And I think there's 2 aspects to that. One is that people will learn from, I think, the experiences of what we've seen with parties to date and try and avoid making those same mistakes. They'll probably be more likely to pick up or identify candidates who are likely to stand at the next election, because there were an awful lot of people who came out of the woodwork on the day of announcing that you would stand, you were standing, and nobody seemed to know that those candidates were thinking of standing, and they may or may not have been suitable people to go into parties. So if you really are doing it properly and you start 2 years in advance of the next election, you've got far more chance of getting those things right. And if you get those things right, you've got more chance of having a more sustainable party, I suspect.
So any party that hasn't started already has left it too late?
I don't think they've left it too late. I think they've just left themselves an awful lot of work to do in a short space of time. And certainly I would say, and I would never want to put anybody off forming a party, don't underestimate how much work is involved behind the scenes. And I'm not talking about the candidates, I'm talking about the infrastructure and what needs to be in place to actually hold everything together as a party with the glue, if you like. And I didn't answer the question previously about whips and whatever, but you know, you've got to decide whether you have a party whip. Do you have a party whip on all the core issues that you all believe in? Do you leave it entirely up to candidates to vote or elected deputies to vote as they see fit on everything else, or do you try and have a whip on there as well? And that becomes really difficult because you don't even know what issues are going to arise after the election. So how can you have a view on pre-election on how you're going to vote? You're committing to vote for something that you don't even know is ever going to crop up. So I think having a full whip on matters which crop up on an island of this size, which can be as diverse as anything.
What about matters that were in your manifesto, like no more taxes, for instance?
That becomes quite difficult when, it is a very valid point. I think when better information emerges, or people become better aware of information which either did exist or hadn't been identified as existing, or whether things have got worse since the election, then the ability to react and people's views on whether it is better to accept that you might have got a new view based on better information is a very valid question. Is it better to dig in and stick to what you said in your manifesto when you know that some circumstances have changed which you didn't take into account? Now, that's a very subjective view. People have got different views on that. But again, the earlier that you start the whole process, the likelihood is that people will be better prepared with the knowledge and the information that they are going to need once they get elected. And I think that's, it really isn't a 5-minute job or a 3-month job or whatever to put a political party together that is likely to get way past the election. Yes, I mean, obviously you don't want it to last a week like one party did, or non-party, whichever way you look at it. But the fact is, you're trying to build something that's going to last through at least one term, and that needs good preparation.
Yeah, can I just do a supplementary? And also the difficulty is that when you are elected and you get your membership elected, they will go on different committees. So some of them will have a lot more information than actually it's confidential information until it's actually put into a policy paper. Does that also present difficulties for parties coming together?
Yeah.
Because you will have members that will not be able to share information and may want to disagree from the party with the committee that they're on.
Absolutely, yeah, no question about that, I think.
And I think that's something that's difficult perhaps for the public to understand that.
Yeah, no, very much so. And, you know, whether it's just on individual committees or, you know, whether you know, being a party member when you're also on P&R, you know, is probably an exceptionally difficult thing to actually manage. It's bad enough, I think, on one of the other committees, but I think when you're on P&R, I think that can be a heck of a conflict, because you are party to information that you can't even share with your fellow party members, and that is really difficult.
It is certainly difficult. Because we're almost at a standing start. But the extent to which political parties did exist for the 2020 election, I'm aware from all of the people I spoke to, it did make the job somewhat easier of choosing those 38 candidates. Because if there was some limit on one's capacity to process all 919 manifestos, there was some shall we say, coalescing around certain ideas or principles that could be identified. But one must bear in mind that, so far as I can ascertain, there are only a handful of jurisdictions throughout the world that are non-partisan in terms of their political system, electoral system. The largest that I've been able to find by population is Indonesia, and that has a very, very widespread population of 100,000 over many, many islands. Otherwise, they're very small island states in the Pacific Basin and elsewhere. We are exceptional. We are unorthodox. And if we restrict our discussion to different forms, as we have been, of plurality block voting, or island-wide being a plurality or in one block vote, if we restrict our discussion to that, then we are just discussing different forms of our unorthodoxy. We need to look outside of the island, we need to get advice, we need to think how best we can go about this, because there are so many different forms of party systems around the world that we can look to for models.
One of the things that makes me nervous about parties is what Nigel just said, which is actually their existence in the last election made it easier, because we have 38 deputies. I worry you may have a party with a couple of superstar people with real presence who will go out there, and because they will be very impressive, you get another 9 complete duffers who just happen to have the same badge on them, and then you've got, you know, getting on for a third of the states elected in that way. Because the only way it makes it easier is if you're not examining all of the individuals, you're just saying, yeah, they're a tick because I support that party. And I think there's a real danger in that.
Can I... Mr. Delaware, can I come to your submission that you sent in kindly? Thank you. I had a couple of questions here that I'll try to combine into one, because I think one of your conclusions in your paper to us was effectively that the findings of the what you called the reshaping of government review, which I think means the committee that's looking at the machinery of government and how that might be affected, that should be sorted first, that should be settled first, and then the electoral system should follow on from that, and not the other way round. Is that a view that you stick to? And if so, I mean, what do you think is the best electoral system, taking into account what is likely to be the system of government? I think it's fair to say that you're not a big fan of the consensus system. Is that right?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there. I knew you would ask me this. I'm greatly comforted by the approach that SMC have taken in this, in the call for evidence, and well, particularly in these hearings, in that you're considering both of those issues, the system of government and the electoral system. It seems in parallel. I know there are separate committees looking at them. I appreciate that, but you're not. When we haven't been over these sessions considering the electoral system in complete isolation of the political system. Let me say that perhaps my thinking has evolved a little bit since I wrote that, and I think it's very important that they match each other, they go hand in hand, that they, the one fits the other. I think that's very important. For example, if we want to have a... Let me start again. The purpose of an electoral system, according to the Electoral Knowledge Network, is to transform the expressed will of the voters into people who will represent it. The will of the voters isn't being expressed either under our previous system or under island-wide voting at the moment in proportion to what their will actually is. And in order to achieve that, and that by that I mean proportional representation, in order to achieve that, you need the right system of government in order to have an electoral system that will achieve the representation of the will of the people in government. I can see you're wondering what I mean by that. What I mean by that is something that Deputy Burford brought up on Monday, and it's the issue of wasted votes. Without wanting to get too bogged down in the campaigns for proportional representation in the United Kingdom, but it is known that throughout the United Kingdom, a vast percentage of votes that are cast by people are completely wasted. They amount to absolutely nothing for them at all, which is why Swap My Vote websites are emerging and so on and so forth. In Guernsey, a number of votes are cast that don't go anywhere at all. In the island-wide voting, if you analyse the votes that were actually cast, that were cast for people who didn't get elected, that represented 46.6% of the votes cast, as compared with, in the UK, the wasted votes were 45.3. But on top of that, as a point you raised, Deputy Burford, is the fact that, on average, rather than casting 38 votes, the electors cast only 26 of them. And if you work the numbers, meaning that each person on average wasted 12 votes that they could have cast but didn't cast, then the wasted votes at our last election were 63.6%. Admittedly, under the previous parochial system, the wasted votes were only 35%, but the entire electorate didn't have the same choice before them as to how to elect representatives to their central government, which is why island-wide voting was so popular. So we have to address that, and the only way to address that is to have an electoral system that matches a system of government that expresses the wishes of the voting population in the proportions in which they vote. And if we are starting with a near blank piece of paper here as to what electoral system we want, it can be achieved in Guernsey with, for example, an open list proportional representation system.
I think one of the problems is that we're thinking about, will we have what we've always had, which is a system of independence, or will we have a fully fledged party system where the electorate will be able to choose almost who gains a majority in the parliament, whether it be a single party or a coalition of parties, through proportional representation? The likelihood is, I think, for at least 10 or 20 years, you would get some parties standing, you would still get a preponderance of individuals being elected. You would not be able to, as Mrs. LePage, be able to say, well, yeah, here's one vision and one sort of set of policies that hang together and are costed, which I don't like because it's going in the wrong direction. Here's another. You'll be able to do that, but you won't get the outcome until you have the fully fledged party system. So how you get from, I still wouldn't want it, by the way, but it's one of my big things. How do you get from here to there? Again, I look to Jersey. You've had a party that's been ingrained for some time. They know they're going to be in opposition when they stand, and they can put forward policies accordingly. They want to be the majority. I don't suggest they're playing games and just doing the easy thing, but they still know that they're not going to be. And so it's getting from our unusual system to a fully fledged party political system, which I think would be the most difficult period.
Just following on from that, one of the options in the referendum was option D, which was namely 4 equal districts. If that had been successful in the referendum, do you think, and I open it up to all of you, do you think that would have been a better stepping stone for the development of political parties? Would the
I was one of the few that voted for it, but it wasn't for that reason. It was my first choice, but yeah.
I'm not sure about the point about whether it would or wouldn't have benefited political parties, because it would have depended entirely, obviously, on how many party candidates were sitting in each of those districts. But it's the option I favoured all along because it's more manageable. To me, I mean, I lived out in the West for 20 years, and choosing 6 from 8, became a point of, well, who do I not want to get in out of these 8? Not rather than I'm voting for 6 people, I'm just trying to avoid the 2 worst ones, which isn't healthy democracy. But it's, is that any better or any worse than picking 38 from 119? To my mind, if you've got 4 or 5 districts where you're picking 8 or 9 from 25, it's manageable for everybody, for the electorate, because you've only got 25 that you really need to do your homework on. It's manageable for the candidates because they've got only double what they had previously in terms of canvassing. It just seemed a more natural halfway house to going from one extreme to the other. But as I said, I just don't think you can draw any conclusion on the aspect of political parties, because you might have had all 4 districts having an equal number of candidates from political parties, or they may have all been concertinaed into 2 of those districts. So you wouldn't get a true outcome of that question. Yeah?
But the advantage of it to me was not part of politics. It's what Nigel was saying at the beginning of trying to maximise people's feeling that how much of their government they're choosing. Yeah. Against the other criterion, which is making it a manageable system of election. So we got 38 deputies. If it was 4 districts, could have been 3, but 4, you'd have 9. You would be able to get, St Peterborough did it for years. You would be able to get all of the candidates on a hustings. And I really wouldn't underestimate how important that was. It was the only place you could see people's performance under fire, if you like, and really make a judgment about what they were like. And the fact that that's gone out the window, I think it's been one of the biggest losses.
Well, one of the criticisms we had on Monday of the hustings was that, on the whole, 200, maybe 300 people, if you were lucky, out of an electorate of, thousands, turned up.
It went back to the constituent. The first time I got in 1982, when nobody expected me to, I did it, I'm sure, largely on the performance at the hustings. It was only talking to people in the Vale Duzane room, but the number of people who told me in the days after that, my auntie was in the Vale Duzane room, or my brother was at the Vale Duzane room, it went out. To replace it with all sitting like lemons in Beausejour, where you can actually nuance your answers, you pick up very easily the signals from people coming up and talking to you. You can only give one answer to a crowded room. You can't actually think, I think that person wants to hear this and this person wants to hear that. So I thought that was the right balance between the two, where you could, but it would have pleased nobody, because you had the extreme that wanted the parochial politics, and you had the extreme that wanted, I want to vote for all of my government, and therefore it was always likely to lose, I guess. But I thought it was the best option.
Or the least worst option.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
You looked at the options very
We
closely.
looked at the options in considerable detail, and it's interesting that we find something we share in common between the 3 of us, that all 3 of us felt that a gradualist approach of option D, which was 4 electoral districts, was the most favoured. There is a tendency in the island, and there's a tendency in politics towards binarism, that there is only one right way and one wrong way to do anything. Actually, the best solution often lies very near the middle, in a sense of proportionality of all of the different factors that you're presented with. And Deputy Roffey will know that. You serving deputies will know that better than anybody. Unfortunately, when it comes to campaigning, as Deputy Roffey has just said, the options are presented in a binary way. And in fact, the campaigning of those in favour of island-wide voting and those in favour of the status quo emphatically stated that those who favoured either of those two options should not use the transferable vote system. They should abandon their second option. And in fact, if you analyse the results, it's very, very possible that a hybrid option would have succeeded if those who were prepared to exercise their second vote,
yes, that's right,
instead of island-wide voting, but this is the compromise I would go for. All those who were keen on maintaining the status quo and had that as their first option, if they exercised their second vote, a compromise may very well have got in.
There was a real misunderstanding of how single transferable votes referendums work. The message that was going out from, as you say, both camps at the extremes, is if you put a second or third choice, you lessen the chances of your first choice being successful. Absolute utter nonsense. Your second choice would only be engaged when and if your first choice had been eliminated. And if it had been eliminated anyway, you're not damaging it by having a second choice. But that was a message that was going around everywhere. Yeah.
But the first choice that you saw in my submission was option D, on the basis that it would increase the proportion of the state's elected deputies that voters could vote in from 15% to 25%. So it's trending towards being able to vote for who is going to form your central government, at the same time as giving a period in which parties could emerge if that is what people wanted. Unfortunately, because we ended up with island-wide voting, there wasn't time for them to. It was necessary to have parties, but there wasn't time for them to emerge properly and in a mature and sensible way. And at the same time, all of the practical disadvantages of island-wide voting have been felt. Our problem, as I say again, has been not only in the referendum, but in a lot of the discussions that are taking place. We're considering variations of a block vote system, which doesn't achieve proportional representation and ignores the benefits of partisan systems all around the world of all sorts of different types that enable a much better outcome for people, in my opinion.
Thank you. Deputy Roffey, you say that you used significantly fewer than your 38 votes because you were unwilling to fly blind. So what do you make of the fact that over 20% of people did use all 38 votes?
I think it's their absolute right to do so. All I can say is that as a complete political anorak, I was unable to appraise well over 100 candidates and actually confirm in my own mind that they were the right people to actually be elected. And therefore, I almost swung to the opposite extreme and said, I am going to vote for the people I know I want to be in the States, and then stop, because I didn't want to vote for a few people I've got a hunch because they said a couple of nice things in their one page, and possibly that vote I gave them be the one that will outweigh the person that I really want to be in the States. So people will have different approaches, but that's how I went about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the evidence that's come forward to us from other areas as well, is that people were voting tactically, but in both tactics, you know, to keep people out and to stop people or to get people in. In other words, it possibly even cancelled itself out because...
Yeah, I'm not sure I would call mine tactical. I was just only willing to vote for people who I had looked into sufficient depth to be absolutely sure in my own mind that I thought would be good deputies. Mm-hmm. But, of course, I was leaving the choice over the rest to other people by doing that, so there's no perfect way of doing it.
And going to the question that we asked the previous panel, I think you might have all been here, about the number of votes. We were quite surprised to see that there was quite a majority amongst our survey respondents for reducing the number of votes that people have. What's the views of the panel on that?
I'd be completely opposed. Even though I think it's impractical to have 38 votes, if you're going to elect 38 people, I think you should have the right to vote for up to 38 people. If you had, say, 10, and there were 8 people that, you know, because they led us through COVID or whatever reason, everybody seemed to vote for them because they were the standout stars, then the rest of it would become a lottery for the rest of who filled the rest of the seats. So I would not reduce the number.
You only increase the number of wasted votes.
Sorry?
You only increase the
Right.
number of wasted votes.
Okay.
The actual representation of the wishes of the people is even further reduced. All we're doing with that is tinkering around the edges of an already faulty system.
So you find it quite interesting that around about 3/4 of people said that the number of votes they have should be reduced.
Perhaps that reveals one of the great challenges of this is that the design of an electoral system, I've discovered over the weeks and months that I've been looking at this, is incredibly complex. Mm-hmm. Incredibly complex. How you achieve it is further complex. We're certainly not going to achieve it this afternoon. But what we have to appreciate is just as how the referendum operated, the limitations on people's understanding of even how to vote and what the outcomes of them using their transferable vote would be, how very difficult it is to go to the population and get across what it is that they really need. Now, what island-wide voting has achieved is that 100% that involvement in the election, over 100% of the central government. I didn't for one moment mean to suggest that parochial voting meant that you're voting for people who were not interested in island politics. But what one is interested in is to have a say in the composition of your central government, and you didn't have that previously. Mm-hmm. Under island-wide voting, there is at least that achieved, that you have a say in the composition of your central government. Yeah. But what you don't have is all of the mechanisms and structures around it to make it possible mechanically to cast your votes in a meaningful way and that your views are represented.
It's more a reflection on too many people just believing that trying to select 38 was just too big a task for them, and they probably got bored at 25 and they were almost not making up names, but going through a process without feeling that they were adding in. Why people felt that it was too many votes to have to cast, but I think the task for a lot of people was just overwhelming. You know, when you get your book this thick to plough through, and how many people can be bothered to do that? Those who are seriously interested in politics will do it. An awful lot just gave up, probably. Mm-hmm. And I think it could be as much a reflection on that as it is on anything other, any other aspects of the whole process. Just too big a task.
Okay, thank you. I think it's Deputy Leclerc.
This one to Deputy Roffey. How has the lottery for the final 10 deputy places, as you put it, affected the quality of governance in Guernsey?
Hard to say. I think we used to get this a little bit with St Peter Port before it was split between North and South, and particularly when there were a very large number. It did become a bit of a lottery. That didn't mean that the numbers that came up were bad numbers, but it did mean that it was almost accidental who filled the last few seats. And I haven't studied what percentage of the total votes the people who filled the last few seats this time, and I'm not going to attack the people who came in, in those last few seats and say they're not good deputies, but it's not really the quality of those people, it's just really whether they are a positive choice from the community or almost happenstance opposed to the few that come underneath. That is my concern there, I guess. The last person came in was Deputy Meerveld, wasn't it? Yes. I noticed he took very much the argument of Nigel saying that people weren't able to vote for people that were outside their district, and his main reason for wanting island-wide voting was his mum couldn't vote for him. But I don't know, he's got evidence his mum wanted to vote for him anyway. So
I don't think he said it was his main reason. But may I just pick up on something from that that Deputy Roffey has spoken to there and was discussed on Mondays, in Monday's sessions, and that's the quality of candidates who stand. We haven't, and I hope we don't run out of time to do so, covered what I perceive to be the advantages of political parties, one of which is, of course, to act as a vehicle for inviting people to join them, to vetting them, to deciding whether or not they are suitable candidates to represent the party. But on top of that, and something very much more important, I think, is that the formation of parties enables those who stand to specialise because they have a groupthink and they can draw on the resources, expertise of other people in the party. The comment was made on Monday, I believe by Mary Lowe, that there is a tendency for a need, and there is a need, for people to stand for election and be elected who have some business acumen and some financial acuity. But to a certain extent, that does limit the field. If a party wants to gain seats, it pays it to represent very broadly the spectrum of the population. It's demonstrably, apparently, demonstrably the case that party politics, party political systems encourage the involvement of women in politics. It's demonstrably the case that minority groups are better represented through parties because there's an incentive to ensure that those minorities are indeed represented. It enables diversity of candidate of all sorts of different type that we are not achieving here. We have an homogeneity of style, of age, gender, perhaps background. I'd like to see a very much more diverse composition of the states. But unfortunately, any person who stands as a member of the states has to declare that either they have the answer to everything or they have access to the answer to everything. They have to be a jack of all trades and a master of quite a few. And I think a party political system will address all of that enormously. And when it comes finally to regional and parochial issues, again, it serves a party well to make sure that they have representatives regionally to the extent that regional or local parochial politics are important. So they will make sure that those candidates that they have in their suite or on their list will have that broad representation.
I could easily make sophist arguments in favour of a party political system, and it wouldn't be entirely sophist because I think there are some very significant advantages, and some of those Nigel has outlined. I just think that in the Guernsey context there are a lot of drawbacks. One of them is that, to be honest, we've only got so much talent, haven't we? I mean, so your 38 members are elected, you look at them, you think 10 have got both the ability and the experience to really lead big departments, but 5 of them are going to be, or 6 of them are going to be in opposition because they're not the leading party or the leading coalition of parties. I think that's a squandering of talent that we can't afford. And also, I know it's not inevitable, and I know it's not the Scandinavian experience or maybe the Dutch experience, but parties do tend to ingrain this adversarial, unpleasant approach to politics that we're seeing enough of in Guernsey at the moment, even without party politics. So maybe that's an argument, what have we got to lose, let's go for parties. But I think it would be even harder to reverse out of that if we actually have a full-blown party system. But I'm not denying some of the advantages, because there are some. Yeah.
Okay.
I would prefer party politics to personality politics, and we definitely have the latter at the moment.
Yeah. But
Did you want to come in on that at all, Dave?
No, I can't disagree with that. I think the perception, whether it's accurate or not, the perception is that it does facilitate tribalism, which may have existed with or without it, but perception is everything, and that's how it is. I mean, people will resent a party because they don't like the party, but again, that's almost playing the ball and not playing the man and not the ball. It's if there were people who didn't vote for any candidates from parties at the last election, there were people equally who did vote for people who collectively were in a party. Where that trade-off, votes gained versus votes lost, we don't know. Nobody knows. It's impossible to know. But I think there are people who are so vehemently against the concept of parties that they'll probably never change their mind. But it could be because it's a halfway house, because we haven't got a full-blown system. If we had a full-blown system, people who are against parties might actually be more in favour of it. But until we get there, you know, you're in no man's land, really, and very difficult to know what that outcome would be.
I bumped into a senior statesman of earlier years the other day, not has been in the States for quite some years, and he said, Peter, how on earth do we get back to a government of all the talents? Because that's what he thought used to happen when he was in the States, that they just chose the best people for the leadership roles. I'm not convinced. I'm not saying that's totally incompatible with party politics, but I think it makes it a lot harder to do. I do agree with Nigel that personality politics are far worse than party politics, but unfortunately it's not an either or. You can get personality politics with parties or without, and you can get rid of them with or without. But I completely agree that that's the biggest task at the moment, is to try and get this vitriol out of local politics.
I think just one final question from Michelle, and then we are going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, so Pete, you said that island-wide voting encourages a surfeit of candidates, some who are less than committed. Can you say any way of resolving this issue, and have we got some less than committed candidates that have been elected this time round?
Lord, you're asking me to. Yeah, maybe one or two. I think there have been people who have floated through the first 3 quarters of this assembly without maybe engaging in the workload in the way I would have expected. How can you? I don't think you can. One of the problems with the island-wide voting is you have to overcome the difficulty of being a candidate by facilitating it. And by facilitating it, you say, we will organise everything for you. You're not expected to knock on doors. You're not expected to be on. You will be in this brochure. We will make a little film of you. Somebody else can be writing all your words for you. And I think you have to do that under an island-wide voting system. And if you have to do that, then there's less of a barrier for people who may not be fully committed. As I said, I think earlier, going back in full circle, just thinking, let's give it a punt. I think in the old days, those people would have been caught out. Yeah. They would have been, people would have got to know them better and say, actually, this person's, all gas and no gators or whatever. And I'm not sure that happens now.
And was that made easier by some of the parties that had formed for the last election? Because they would have had even less to do because they had the party mandate as well.
Yeah, that would have helped. But I think it's more down to the island-wide voting system than that. But than to parties, to be fair.
Okay. Right, I'm sure we could go on for quite some considerable time, but we're going to have to leave it there. So I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed for another interesting session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.